saved his money and went up and went Dall sheep hunting. And on his hunt, he paid a group of Indians to guide him into this area. And they got into the area and they saw this bunch of sheep that were about 3 miles off. And they went in on horseback. And they got in to within about a mile of where the sheep were. And the Indians told him, "We can't go any farther because that's sacred ground." And after a week of going in on horseback, they just told my dad they weren't going to go any farther. And a whole week was shot, and the trip was ruined. And that was the summation of his Dall sheep hunt. And it cost him a lot of money. But anyway, he never got his Dall sheep. That's kind of a long story, but he always was sick because he really wanted to go and get a shot at a Dall sheep. Well, anyway, years later, I was up in Alaska. I went up on business, and I walked into a drugstore to pick up some cough medicine. I was up there on business. I had sold a truck wash to a company to wash their fleet of trucks. And when I was in the drugstore, I noticed these beautiful heads of 4 Dall sheep. And the gal that was behind the counter, I said, "Who shot those sheep?" And she says, "Our young pharmacist." And I said, "Is he here?" And she said, "Yes." And I said, "Wow, would you introduce me to him?" So she said, "Yeah," and she went back and brought him out and introduced me to him. And we got to talking, and I told him where I was from and that I loved to hunt. And I was a big elk hunter, but obviously I'd never been sheep hunting. And he looked at me and he said, "How long are you going to be here in Alaska?" And I said, "Well, I'll be here for another 3 or 4 days." He said, "Tell you what, how would you like to go Dall sheep hunting?" And I said, "Oh, I'd love it." And he said, "I'll tell you what, if you're going to be here for another 3 or 4 days, go down to the Department of Motor Vehicles and get your Alaskan driver's license. And that way you'll be an Alaskan resident, and I'll take you Dall sheep hunting. And all we have to do then is just pay for your hunting license, and we'll go where I get my Dall sheep, and I can pay the guide just for the use of his area, and I'll be your guide." And I said, "What a deal." So I was all excited. I said, "Let me ask you a question. What if I invite my dad up and he can go along as well?" And he says, "Sure. He just have to pay an out-of-state license fee, but that would be fine. I'd guide the both of you." And I said, "Wow, what a deal." So anyway, we ended up making arrangements. I went and got my Alaska driver's license, and you can only hunt sheep in the month of August. And this was like in April or May when I was talking to the pharmacist, so he had plenty of time. And I didn't tell my dad, but about in June, I called my dad up and I said, "How would you like to go Dall sheep hunting?" And he said, "Oh, sure." Thought I was joking. And I says, "You better get ready and better get yourself in shape because we're going Dall sheep hunting." And I told him what I had done. And I said, "It's all paid for. I've got your airline ticket. I got your license and everything all paid for. All you got to do is just get yourself ready." And that was going to be coming up in August. Well, anyway, 2 weeks before we were to go, he had a massive heart attack and wasn't able to go. And I was just heartsick because I knew how much he wanted to do that. And here I had paid for the trip, paid for his license, paid for the guide, the whole bit. And my real dear friend at work, where I worked, I called him up. We had been elk hunting buddies for years. I called him up and I said, "Hey, Jack, how'd you like to go sheep hunting?" And he says, "Oh, you got to be joking." And I said, "No." I said, "Do you think you could get some time off?" And I told him what had happened with my dad and about how I'd gotten the tickets and everything to go sheep hunting. And he says, "Yeah, I'll go." And I said, "Will you able to get the time off from work?" He said, if I can't, I'll quit my job." So anyway, he made arrangements to go, and we went up to Alaska, and we flew up on Alaska Airlines, rented a car, and drove over to a little town called Wrangell, Alaska. And there, bush pilot, we made arrangements to have him pick us up, and he flew us in to the guide's base camp and dropped us off at the base camp. And from there is where we would hunt the Dall sheep. This guy that was the guide that we were going to use his area, the pharmacist that was going to be our guide. This is another part of the story. When we got up to Alaska, we called him up and said, "Well, we're here, we're ready to go." And we talked to the secretary at the drugstore. He says, "Geez, I'm sorry to tell you, but he had an automobile accident, broke both of his legs. He's not going to be your guide." So Jack and I were going to be our own guides since we'd already paid for the trip. We didn't have a choice. So it was Jack and I in this incredible country, and the bush pilot picked us up. Tom Spurstad was his name, and he was quite the guy. Him and his wife had been guides for almost 30 years, and they picked us up, flew us in on their little Super Cub airplane, dropped us off at this little base camp that he built some 30 years before, where he dropped his hunters off and where he would guide them. And since we were going to be guiding ourselves, he dropped us off and said, "Okay, guys, I'll be back here to pick you up in 10 days. And we said, "Okay, see you in 10 days. And from there, he flew off, and we were there. And we thought, well, we'll get all set up. We had a little two-man cabin. Actually, it actually would sleep six, but it was just the two of us. We unloaded all of our gear and decided that we'd start the next day scouting, looking for Dall sheep. And the next day we went out and started hiking up the side of this glacier. And we went up probably about a mile up the glacier, and Jack got out his spotting scope, and about 2 miles up, as near as we could tell, we spotted a bunch of sheep that looked like off the side of the glacier on the other side. So anyway, we decided that what we'd have to do is cross the glacier, hike our way up, and we knew that we'd have to cross the glacier, get up high above the sheep, because we'd never be able to get them if we came up below. because they'd spot us. We'd have to come down on top of them, or they didn't notice us. So the next day, we got up early, and took us about almost 2 hours just to cross the glacier, and then we hiked up the side of the mountain and started traversing across the side of the mountain. And as we were hiking, we were just, booking as best we could. And all of a sudden, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something white down below us. And I tapped Jack on the shoulder and motioned to him that there was something down below us that I'd noticed. And we had taken with us in my backpack these little bags that were elk bags that were white. And I thought, well, we could cut holes for arms and for the head, and we pulled those over us so we'd look at least something like we were sheep. And we did that, and we got down on our stomachs, and we crawled down maybe 60, 70 yards, and we came out on a ledge, and below us, as near as I can determine, there was about 25 to 30 sheep, and there were probably 17 or 18 really nice rams. And we got to shaking so bad, I told Jack, I said, now let's make sure we don't shoot the same sheep. And I said, you tell me which one you're going to shoot, and then I'll tell you which one I'm going to shoot. And we'll count to 3, and when we get to 3, we'll both pull our triggers. And that's what we did. And we both got our sheep, and we got to shaking so bad. I mean, I couldn't hardly believe that we had taken 2 really beautiful doll rams. And it took us about a half an hour to get down to where we'd killed these sheep. And all the rest of the sheep had scattered. But when we got down to our 2 really nice sheep, a bigger sheep than the ones that we had shot came out from underneath the cliff that we had shot off of, and he stood there and watched us dress those 2 sheep out until we were completely done, and then he took off. I was never in my life so tempted to shoot that sheep, because he had to be a record book sheep. And he just stood there like he was a statue. And I don't know what possessed me not to shoot him. But anyway, we got our sheep all dressed out. And by then, it was late in the afternoon. And we started to get down to where the glacier was, and we got maybe about a quarter of a way across the glacier, because we were going to head back to where our base camp was, and we ran out of daylight, and we had to spend the night on the glacier, and we didn't have sleeping bags or anything with us, but all we had is I had our little 2-man tent and 2 of these little survivor bags look like a little aluminum coverings, and we put the sheep up against a couple of boulders on the glacier, and that was about 4:30 in the afternoon when it went dark. And we huddled up against the back of those sheep skins and pulled those 2 survivor bags up around us and hugged each other. And we spent from 4:30 until 10 o'clock when the sun came up on that glacier. And I swear That's the coldest I've ever been in my bloody life. But when that sun came up, that was the most incredible feeling you can imagine. And we packed our gear up, made it back across the glacier, and about noon we got back to our base camp, hung our sheep up. We went in, had something to eat, and as near as I can determine, it was probably about 1 o'clock. We climbed into the cabin and got into our sleeping bags, and we didn't wake up until 4 o'clock the next day. Not a peep out of either one of us. And when we woke up, I still had a goat tag, and across from our cabin, across the glacier, maybe a quarter of a mile, you could see a bunch of goats. Now this was only on the third day. We talked about going across that glacier for another 6 days, and that didn't have the energy to do anything but just sit and enjoy the sights until the bush pilot picked us up and took us back to Anchorage. When we got back to Anchorage, we went to the hospital where our pharmacist was and told him about our trip and everything. And told him we'd booked a flight back to Portland. And he said, "What are you going to do with your sheep?" And I said, "Well, we'll just check the skins and horns at the airport." He said, "No, you don't do that." He said, "They'll disappear. Those ramper guys, they'll take those horns and capes and they'll steal them. And when you get to Portland, you won't have them." He said, "They sell those things for a lot of money." And I said, "How are we going to get them?" He says, "Unless you've got some better way to ship them, don't check them at the airline." So anyway, when we got to the airport, I paid for 2 first-class tickets for Jack and I, and 2 for the elk horn or the sheep horns. And we were the only time in Alaska's history, I'm sure, that I had my horn sitting next to me in a first-class seat, and Jack had his sheep horns sitting next to him in a first-class seat. And we had more passengers talking to us on that flight from Anchorage to Portland, and you can shake a stick at. But that's my story of my sheep hunt, and it was still the greatest experience in my life. That's my sheep story. Yeah, it was quite a story. And if anybody tells you walking across a glacier is a cup of tea, don't believe it. It is hard work. Those glaciers, they sound like during the day and the night, you'd swear you were on top of a Caterpillar tractor. It's just a continual grinding of the snow moving those rocks. Unbelievable. But what beautiful, beautiful country. Everybody should go to Alaska at some point in their life. And my sheep head is in my grandson's Matthew's bedroom, and I have a replica of it in our front room, and it's just, again, the best hunting experience anybody could ever ask for. I hope that'll help you. You betcha. You have a good evening, okay? Look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks, girl. Well, Grandma and I are excited to see all of you. You look beautiful, girl. I'll let you go, okay? Love you so much. Bye bye.